10 o'clock at my time, so I guess maybe we can get started. We have so much to talk about. So welcome, everyone. This is going to be the fourth webinar of the Psychology of Wellbeing. And what I will do is I'm going to start sharing my slides. So again, what we're doing is we're following the book. This is how the book is broken down. It's essentially, we're using it as a textbook. And we completed the philosophical foundation definitions and measures, the consequences of happiness, that's chapter 3. And then last time we finished talking about objective reality and its effects on happiness. And these are chapters 4 to 8, but again, we didn't get a chance to focus completely or get a chance to complete the last chapter or two. So I'm counting on you to do the additional reading on your own. Now, I hope we'd be able to complete subjective reality and its effects on happiness. This is the third module. And in the context of the third module, this is what we're going to be talking about. We're going to be talking about the research dealing with personality effects on well-being, effects of affect and cognition, effects of belief and values, effects of needs and need satisfaction, goals, self-concept, social comparisons. These are essentially the main topics of what I allude to as the subjective reality. And again, there's just enormous amount of research on these topics. So let's start out with personality. And what we're going to be talking about in the context of personality would be neuroticism, extroversion, self-esteem, affective disposition, character strength, and a whole bunch of other personality traits. And then we'll get to explain or at least discuss some of the theories, personality theories that are related directly to well-being. So let's start out with neuroticism and extroversion. Now, these two personality traits have a very long history, not only in personality psychology, but also in the psychology of well-being, in terms of, again, establishing a very direct, well, I wouldn't say direct, a very strong relationship between those personality traits and subjective well-being. And we're going to try and understand why. And so we're going to use neuroticism and extroversion to explain some of, or at least to discuss some of the personality theories. So the idea is neuroticism, i.e. people who are neurotics, some people, are more neurotic than others. Neuroticism is linked to negative affect, negative feelings. Why? Well, again, we're going to be talking a little bit more in terms of personality theories, but again, the gist of it focuses on neurotics tend to have a negative mental frame. They in terms of the metaphor of the jar half empty versus half full. Well, neurotics tend to see the jar as half empty. And therefore they have what we call a negative mental frame. And seeing the world in a very negative, in a negative mental framework leads to experience a lot more negative feelings. And therefore those negative feelings that are experienced by neurotics tends to accumulate. And of course, it affects their life satisfaction. They So they express a lot more life dissatisfaction than others, than the less neurotics. Extroversion is the converse. Extroversion, people who are extroverted are the ones that are always sociable. Well, actually, there's in personality psychology, there is a distinction between introversion, extroversion, and what you call social shyness. Social shyness is a little bit more of a psychological concept. Introversion, extroversion is a little bit more biologically based. So you think in terms of, we are born, genetically speaking, with a nervous system, and the strength of the nervous system, the malleability of the nervous system, reflects a certain amount of introversion and extroversion. So those people who are introverted tend to have what you might call a weak nervous system. Well, I wouldn't say weak in a metaphorical sense. Weak in the sense that any kind of stimulation from the outside, they become sensitive to. So introverts, by definition, biologically speaking, they tend to kind of withdraw, and they become a little bit more socially isolated because, again, social stimulation is too much for them. In one way, actually, I think of myself as being an introvert in the sense that, hey, I like to socialize with friends and family members and other people, but if you put me in a social environment that creates so much what you might call social stimulation, I say, hey, wait a minute, enough is enough. I would draw to, I'd rather read a book rather than become overly stimulated. So it has something to do with the strength of the nervous system. But and therefore, by definition, biologically speaking, extroverts tend to seek social stimulation because, again, the strength, their nervous system requires that kind of stimulation in order to maintain a certain level of adaptation, a certain what you might call a homeostasis. Again, if I use the biological concept of homeostasis, in the sense that we become adaptive to a certain level and that we become used to it, and that is that adaptation level is dictated and controlled by a homeostatic mechanism. Are you familiar with the concept of homeostasis in biology? Like, for example, you get hungry. Well, how do you get hungry? Because your blood sugar level dips below, again, the adaptation level, and therefore you feel hunger. And then you become stimulated in order to, what you might call, restore homeostatic balance, right? So that's the sort of the psychological, biological mechanism involved with extroversion. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to ask as we move along. Okay. Self-esteem. Now, self-esteem is also a personality construct. And then again, so much research that have dealt with self-esteem. And the evidence is literally overwhelming that people who have high self-esteem tend to report high levels of subjective well-being, and vice versa. Now, why? The question is this whole business of positive self-regard. If you feel good about yourself, then you have positive self-regard. I mean, you feel good about yourself, and literally the whole world is colored is biased by what you might call a positivity bias. And when you do that, those perceptions and ultimately lead to certain behavioral outcomes in those specific life domains. And again, when we talk about life domains, we're talking about social life, work life, family life, love life, leisure life, and so forth. So people who feel good about themselves and tend to also feel good about themselves in different life spheres. And life spheres is very much the corresponding concept would be life domains, as we talk work life, family life, and so forth. So sometimes I think that the research on self-esteem is so confounded because the measures of self-esteem, especially when you use measures that breaks down the self and how people see themselves in different life domains, that's sort of a very typical measure of the self-concept and therefore self-esteem, overlaps very, very closely to what we call domain satisfaction. Remember how we talked about domain satisfaction and how domain satisfaction ultimately affects life satisfaction through some sort of a bottom-up spillover effect, in the sense that when people feel good about the different domains of life, social life, work life, family life, and so forth, there is what you call a trickle up. There is a spillover of those types of feelings unto the judgment of life satisfaction. Yeah, I feel good about myself. I feel good about my life, right? I feel good about, the different domains of my life, those that I consider to be important to me, as social life, as family life, as work life, and so forth. So sometimes I think that the measures of self-esteem and life satisfaction, especially in terms of domain satisfaction, tend to be so, what's the word I'm looking for? Confounded? And maybe that confounding effect may have something to do with this very strong relationships, very strong correlations between self-esteem and measures of life satisfaction. Any questions about that? Again, if you have any questions, that'll be a good time, or you just jot down your questions in the chat room. Okay, well, let's move on to talk about affective disposition. Now, again, there's a lot of research on affective disposition. And in order to appreciate what affective disposition is, you need to kind of look at a typical measure of affective disposition. How often do you feel in general on a typical day? And the idea is that you provide, at least from a measurement perspective, you provide the respondent with a whole bunch of feelings of adjectives. Feelings adjective like bad, angry, sad, negative, unpleasant, afraid, guilty, and jealous. These signal what you call negative affective disposition. And you give them also a bunch of positive adjectives, such as positive, love, good, and happy. And you ask them, to express on a typical day how much do they feel in relation to those affects or affective dimensions. So, I'm looking, and I look at a measure like this. Well, it says no wonder affective disposition is so highly correlated with measures of positive and negative affect, as well as measures of domain satisfaction and life satisfaction. So again, much of the research indicated very strong relationships between affective disposition as a personality trait and measures of subjective well-being. So again, sometimes I think just like self-esteem, these measures are so highly interrelated to the point where there may be a confound between those two constructs. So again, be aware that of the possibility of a confound, a measurement confound between affective disposition and measures of subjective well-being. Character strength. Character strength is another, what you might call a personality trait. And the idea is that well-being researcher has sort of looked at character strength. And as a matter of fact, we'll be talking a little bit more about characters and strength because Martin Seligman, who is essentially the father of positive psychology, this is one of his, what you might call, forte. He talked a lot about character strength with some of his colleagues, like, one of the people who's very well known in positive psychology, who is behind the what you call character strength research program, is Chris Peterson from the University of Michigan. So the idea that personality-wise, people have different traits that reflect strength. And again, if we're talking about things like hope, zest, gratitude, love, curiosity, some people tend to be very much, well, they have strength in terms of, let's say, curiosity. They're very curious, right? That is a character strength. Or they have a zestiness in life, a certain amount of zest of life. They tend to express gratitude a lot more than others. In some ways, you can actually think of it in terms of as a character strength. Researchers have kind of distinguished certain kind of character strength as strength of heart versus strength of mind. Strength of heart is tend to be a little bit more affective, emotionally driven. Strength of mind tend to be a little bit more cognitive. So strength of mind would be things like appreciation of beauty, creativity, judgment, and love of learning. So these are a little bit more cognitive in orientation, and things like hope, zest, gratitude, love, and curiosity, they tend to be a little bit more feelings driven, right? So again, the finding is that the strength of heart are more strongly correlated with measures of well-being than the strength of mind. Well, I'm not very surprised because, many of the, especially if you use measures of subjective well-being that are hedonic, remember we talked about hedonic well-being, if you especially use those measures of hedonic well-being, it's undoubtedly that you'll find a strong relationship between what you might call those character strengths that are related to the heart compared to the mind, so to speak. So how do character strength contribute to well-being? Through setting goals that match character strength and using the skills and experience related to those strengths to achieve those goals. So goal achievement related to strength of heart have greater positive valence than those related to the strength of mind. And that is, in essence, an explanation of why certain character strength tend to be much more related to measures of well-being than others. Okay. Now, there's a whole host of other personality traits that have, again, the research has indicated strong relationships with measures of well-being. And these are internality, perceived control, optimism, expectancy of control, Pollyannism, and genetic disposition to be happy, resilience. The big five personality factors, proactive personality, resilience. Let's just mention something about those in brief. Internality is the extent to which this, when we're talking about personality, we're talking about a disposition to act or behave in a certain manner across a variety of situations. So there is stability in the behavior that reflects a certain disposition, which is very different from what you might call, we act in so many different ways situationally. We're driven by situational cues, and therefore we react accordingly. But personality is dispositional. That means our behavior is reflective of a dispositional tendency, right? So when we're talking about internality, again, those people who tend to score highly on what you call internality traits, those people who essentially attribute much of what's happening to them and what's happening in the surrounding environment to be caused by them. If you might call, you can actually think of it in terms of self-centeredness. And self-centeredness can be good or bad in the sense that, if you make attributions, if you explain things that are happening to you and your surrounding environment is because of things that you've done, right? Then that's, in one way, that gives you a sense of control. Well, the control aspect is good. And as a matter of fact, we'll talk about perceived control as the second point. But on the other hand, it may backfire if, again, you make those kinds of attributions to yourself if there are these negative things that are happening to you, right? And we're going to be talking a little bit more about the theory of depression, the well-being theory of depression, or happiness theory of depression. Well, no, not happiness. The attribution theory of depression. We'll talk a little bit more about that in the next chapter. So the idea is that perceived control is a good thing. And as a matter of fact, sometimes we talk about things like the locus of control. Locus of control is another personality trait that is very much, grounded in the research of what you call perceived control. So those people who have an internal locus of control, if they make attributions about the good things that are happening to them in life, that's, that internal locus of control leads to well-being. But on the other hand, if bad things are happening to them and they make attributions, internal attributions, the reason why things, bad things are happening to me is because it's my fault. I have a character flaw, that kind of thing. If they make those kinds of internal attributions because they have what you might call an internal locus of control, well, that leads to, again, a lower level of well-being rather than the other way around. So there's the research dealing with perceived control, again, especially in relation to locus of control. Optimism has so much research in subjective well-being dealing with optimism. Much of that research has sort of been grounded by Martin Seligman from the University of Pennsylvania. His early research was very much based on learned helplessness And from learned helplessness, it sort of blossomed into, in a very converse way, into optimism. And he and his colleagues developed measures of optimism. So there are these people who are optimistic by personality, personality by disposition, and those people who are pessimistic. And the colloquial connotation associated with optimism and pessimism is pretty much correspond to literally the psychological definition and construal of optimism versus pessimism. And as you can guess, the reason why people who are optimistic tend to also score highly on measures of well-being is because an optimistic tendency is likely to lead people to act in a positive way. If you're pessimistic, then you tend to avoid things. If you're optimistic, you tend to approach things, and approaching things in a positive manner because you expect things good things to happen in relation to what you might be doing, right? And again, the expectancy of control is very much related to that. Expectancy of control is another personality trait that is very much related to optimism, which is the next bullet. Then again, it's very likely that you would experience a high level of positive affect, lower level of negative affect, high level of domain satisfaction in different salient domains, and high level of life satisfaction, and possibly leading up to maybe eudaimonic well-being. Pollyannism comes from the word Pollyann, that is the tendency to be optimistic and to think of everything that's happening around oneself is rosy. It's a rosy picture out there. So that's the gist, the meaning, the core meaning of Pollyannism. And Pollyannism is again, personality psychologists have defined it and construed it and developed measures of this construct. And lo and behold, it's not very surprising that you find high correlations between this construct and other and constructs related to well-being. So again, these are so highly interrelated. Pollyannism and again, optimism, expectancy of control. I hope that makes sense to you. It makes a lot of sense to me. So I hope that translates to that. I have a question from Kanu. What does research say about Cycap and psychological and subjective well-being? Perhaps its 4 dimensions, hero, are considered states, not traits. The only way I can respond to that, and if anybody who knows a little bit more about the hero model, then they can respond. But I would probably need to look at it a little bit more closely in order to make that determination, whether they are more measures of states versus traits. Because again, if they are traits, then yeah, it would be very likely that there would be a strong relationship because of the dispositional nature of those dimensions. Yeah, and we have another by Tassadi, internality, internal locus of control. Yes, that's exactly what we talked about. Okay, so I'm going to move the chat box here so I can see a little bit more clearly. Great. Genetic disposition to be happy. Now, this is, again, an area of research in personality psychology and also the psychology of well-being that have been grounded in what you call twin studies. Twin studies, so you've got identical twins versus fraternal twins. And the idea is that what is the extent to which being happy or being dispositionally happy is very much genetically based. And yes, indeed, much of that research has shown that at least 50% of the variance in behavior tends to be accounted for by a genetic disposition to be happy. So if you're looking at measures of well-being, then there is a very strong relationship between, again, measures of genetic disposition to be happy, right? And measures of well-being. And that comes from, again, that program research dealing with twin studies. Resilience. Now, resilience is a little bit more of a recent concept, recent in the sense that in the last, probably 15, 20 years. Again, we're talking about personality psychology, and they date back way back. So again, we've got a long history of research in personality psychology dealing with well-being. But when it comes to resilience, it's a little bit more of a modern program of research. And the idea of resilience is, again, colloquially speaking, what is a person who is resilient? A person who is resilient, who essentially bounces back from adversity. So when that person experiences a setback in life, well, that setback is not much of a problem. It actually, a person who is resilient learns from the experience, learns from adversity, and bounces back to be a stronger person, and be able to deal with, again, life adversities and other kinds of situations in a much more effective manner, in a much more successful manner. Resilience. Right. And again, those people who are resilient tend to experience a high level of well-being. And as a matter of fact, the research points, if you're looking at variation between measures of well-being, and if you focus on eudaimonic well-being, then you'd see a stronger relationship between, those people who are resilient and those and their expression of eudaimonic well-being. And if you remember the way we talked about eudaimonia, and that is, it's a much more related to personal growth and development rather than hedonia as, positive or negative affect. And therefore it makes a lot more sense when you're dealing with a person who is resilient. That person who's exposed to trauma is not adversely affected by that trauma in terms of his or her well-being, but uses the traumatic experience to learn and grow, right? And therefore that kind of feeds in what you call eudaimonia. The big five personality traits. I don't know whether you know about that, but again, in personality psychology in the last 20 years or so, there's so much research on what you call the big five. And what are the big fives? The big five openness. Openness to what? Openness to experience, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. So much research have been focused on the big five because, much of our behavior can be explained based on the research by these big five personality traits. Openness to experience. The person who is open to experience is the person who is not shut down, is not closed. That person seeks experiences, especially novelty. Novel experience is something that is sought by a person who is open, and again, scores highly on openness to experience measures. And as you can probably guess, those people who are open to experience tend to experience a high level of well-being. And the reason being is because novelty, when they seek novelty, it's very likely that some of these novel experiences are likely to have positive valence, in the sense that when they set certain goals related to novel situations, that goal attainment related to these novel types of situations are likely to produce net positive affect through goal attainment. And therefore that may account for the positive and strong relationship between openness to experience and measures of well-being. Conscientiousness is, if you're a conscientious person, then you're committed, you're loyal, you stay on course, right? You don't deviate much. And actually, if you think in terms of goal commitment, and we'll be talking about goal commitment, if you set a certain goal and you're very conscientious in terms of staying on course, it's very likely that you will attain those goals because of your conscientiousness, right? Would ultimately, and goal attainment would produce positive feelings, and of course, positive feelings is very much reflective of measures of well-being. So in one way, that may explain the relationship between conscientiousness and well-being. Extroversion, we already talked about that, so we don't need to spend hardly any time explaining about the relationship between extroversion and measures of well-being. Agreeableness, is, you probably can think, especially when it comes to teenagers, some teenagers, tend to be what you might call very contrarian, contrarian in the sense that whatever you say, they're going to try and say something opposite. They will counter argue. Well, that's not being very agreeable. And agreeable is sort of a disposition that people become agreeable the older they get. So it's sort of a lifespan kind of a thing. You face the realities of life and you become agreeable more eventually in time. That's why you see a lot of rebellious teenagers, because dispositionally, it's part of growing up, I guess. So those people who are agreeable tend to go along, and they tend to fit better. And when they fit better in the context, whatever environment they're in, let's say the work environment, their family environment, they're likely to attain the goals that they set within those sectors or life domains. And if they attain those goals, then it's very likely that they will feel satisfied in those domains, and that spills over to what you might call life satisfaction. Neuroticism, we already talked about that, so we don't need to, again, say much about it. Oh, I have resilience twice here. So you can drop resilience as the last point, as the last bullet. Proactive personality is a person who, the kind of person who kind of plans and anticipates the future a lot more better than people who tend to be a little bit more past oriented or tend to be fixated on the past. They tend to, again, a bit more anticipatory in their foreseeing the future and acting proactively. And as such, you can see that there might be a relationship between proactive personality and measures of well-being, in the sense that those people who are more proactive are likely to be a little bit more successful in goal attainment in relation to life goals, and therefore goal attainment, produces the kind of positive affect and domain satisfaction that translates into life satisfaction. Let's move to talk about some of the popular theories, personality theories of well-being. Instrumental theory, temperament theory, top-down theory, setpoint theory, genotype theory of happiness, dynamic equilibrium theory, homeostatically protected mood theory. These are the ones that are, at this stage, popular in the well-being literature. Instrumental theory. Instrumental theory says that, wait a minute, the reason why, again, if we're talking about something like extraversion and neuroticism, the reason why extraversion is very much related to measures of well-being is because extroverts, what they do is they seek out situations that are very much related to social stimulation, social connectedness, social relatedness, right? These people, the extroverts, have a dispositional tendency to seek out those kinds of situations. And once they put themselves in those kinds of situations, it's very likely that because of the social, the nature of the social interaction, at least most of the time, leads to positive affect, right? And again, the expression of positive affect through repeated exposure, again, leads to domain satisfaction, ultimately leading to life satisfaction. Temperament is also an offshoot of instrumental theory in the sense that says, people who are extroverts, for example, versus neurotics. Neurotics tend to be sensitive to what you call negative environmental cues. So let's say, for example, if a neurotic is exposed to, let's say, a daily encounter of a colleague at work, and let's say that encounter, that the neurotic runs into a colleague, a coworker, and that person does not say good morning, a morning greeting. A neurotic, by definition, is likely to take that as an insult, as a sign of disrespect, as it would be interpreted as a negative cue. And that dispositionally, the person is likely to take that negative cue and therefore experience lower levels of well-being, at least in this situation. And if it's done repeatedly across a variety of situations over time, of course, it would generate a lower level of well-being. So temperament theory talks about how certain personality traits tend to lead people to be more sensitive to certain kinds of environmental cues. So the extroverts tend to be a little bit more sensitive to social cues and ultimately positive environmental cues, while the neurotics tend to, again, do exactly the opposite. And that's why, again, those particular dispositions, or what you might call personality traits, lead to, again, well-being, subjective well-being. Questions? Top-down theory. Now, top-down theory is kind of very interesting because it has a long history in well-being research. Now, back from the early 70s all the way up to the 80s, there were three very popular theories that has sort of been propagated in the well-being research area, or what you call quality of life research. One is top-down, the other one is bottom-up, and then the other one is horizontal. So we usually talk about a top-down spillover, a bottom-up spillover, a horizontal spillover. What does that mean? Well, we already talked about a bottom-up spillover. A bottom-up spillover is that we experience a whole bunch of life events. And through these life events, we experience positive or negative affect, positive or negative feelings, right? So these positive or negative feelings they influence how we evaluate our life domains. So let's say if I ask you about your love life, or your leisure life, or your family life, well, what you're going to be doing is it depends on how much positive or negative affect you experience in those life domains. So life events and the emotional experiences underlying those life events tend to spill over to life domains, and then we feel satisfied or dissatisfied with life domains, and these life domain satisfaction tend to influence life satisfaction at large. A bottom-up spillover, right? That's bottom-up. We already discussed that. Top-down, on the other hand, is that, wait a minute. If you're happy to begin with, it's very likely that you will be satisfied with different life domains because you will engage in certain kinds of behaviors in those life domains that would make you happy. So it is your happiness to begin with. Your happiness would influence those domains and the life events within those domains. That's a top-down, right? A top-down influence. So again, if you're affectively happy or you have an affective positive disposition, it's very likely that you will engage in certain kinds of behavior in those different domains that would influence your domain satisfaction, which ultimately would be much reflective of your life satisfaction. A top-down influence. Horizontal spillover, on the other hand, deals with if you feel happy with family life, well, the positive feelings that you have in family life will spill over to your work life or your leisure life or your social life, right? So we're talking about how positive or negative feelings from one life domain spills over to other life domains in a horizontal fashion. That's what we call horizontal spillover. So top down, bottom up, and horizontal spillover have been with us in the quality of life research literature for many, many years, and has been a sort of a foundational for the kind of research that we've been doing all along in well-being. Setpoint theory is yet another theory that has a long history in the quality of life research. Setpoint theory says that, wait a minute, those fluctuations of negative or positive affect or life satisfaction over time they don't last. They go back to some sort of a set point. There's a baseline. Every person has a baseline of happiness, of well-being. And as a matter of fact, much research has established that baseline is, if let's say maybe on a scale from 1 to 10, it's somewhere between 7 and 8. It's not necessarily a neutral 5, on a 10-point scale. It's somewhere between 7 and 8. So there is, we have a baseline of happiness, dispositionally speaking, that carries with us across situations, across time. It's dispositional. And whatever we experiences in terms of the uplifts and the irritants, the daily irritants on a daily basis tend to only, create minor fluctuations from the baseline, but they eventually dissipate. Dissipate meaning their effects becomes marginal or minimal to the point that we climb back or we go back to the baseline. That's the set point. So some people, dispositionally speaking, their set point may be 5. That would be low. Some people on the average would be somewhere between 7 and 8. And some people tend to be a little bit 9, or maybe, could be a 10. Well, that would be high. That would be dispositional. That would be their set point. And you fluctuate around that set point, but you always go back to that set point. That's the set point theory, personality theory of well-being. Now, the other one, which is the genotype theory of happiness, is very much related to the set point, but it makes a very definitive assertion. And the assertion is that that set point is genetically based. That means we're born with, based on our DNA, our genotype is happy or sad. So 50%, approximately between 40 to 50% of the variance in behavior is attributed to a disposition, a genetic disposition. And most of that research, again, is based on twin studies, looking at differences between what you call fraternal twins versus identical twins. And that research has shown that there is a genetic disposition towards happiness. Some people are born grumpy. Grumpy as in, some people are born happy. Dynamic equilibrium theory, on the other hand, says, yes, there's a set point, but there are also life events. And life events also tend to influence that set point. So there is a certain level of dynamism between life events and personality traits. And life events tend to influence personality traits, and personality traits tend to influence life events. And therefore, these two interactively and dynamically tend to influence well-being. Take, for example, the idea of extroversion we talked about how extroversion, tend to influence life events. Those people who are extrovert, they seek out sociable occasions, right? So this is a situation in which a personality is very much affecting, the experience of a life event, that, life event of being sociable, interacting with others. That's the essence of what you call dynamic equilibrium theory. Homeostatically protected mood theory is based on the concept of homeostasis, again, biologically driven. But now the person behind homeostatically protected mood theory is Robert, well, we call him Bob Cummings from Deakin University in Australia. He's written so much about this particular theory and explains much of the research, again, through the research on homeostasis. And again, the homeostasis is very much what you might call it, well, I would say an artifact, but maybe very much influenced by Setpoint Theory and maybe the genotype theory of happiness, and there are remnants, or at least similar tenets, theoretical tenets or suppositions, also that are very much related to dynamic equilibrium theory. But the idea is that, again, we have a set point, and again, we try to get back to restore homeostatic balance based on that set point. And life events, again, tend to play a role in allowing us to experience well-being, especially over time. You can, that set point can change if you have repeated experiences. So the environment does take a toll on you. So let's say if we were talking about something like poverty. Poverty takes a toll on well-being. And that is, if a person who is happy to begin with, born in poverty, well, poverty takes a toll. And it creates a whole bunch of adverse life circumstances that affects well-being. Even though that you are born happy, through poverty-stricken experiences, you will experience a lower level of well-being. So here we're talking about, again, a theory that takes into account elements of the environment as well as the what you might call set point premise. Yeah, the premise that, again, our well-being has a sort of a baseline, and we don't fluctuate much from that baseline. Okay, well, it's 11 o'clock my time. Let's take a 10-minute break. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to, again, jot them down in the chat box, and we'll address them as soon as we come back. Okay, we'll see you in 10 minutes. Okay. Let's reconvene. Great. We're done with personality and the effects of personality on well-being. So now what we're going to do is we're going to move into another chapter, and that chapter is affect and cognition. Affect and cognition. And as you can see from this slide, there just so much research dealing with affect and cognition in well-being research. Mood, causal attribution, appraisal, rational emotive therapy, meaning to life, habituation, cognitive frames, multiple discrepancy theories. Oops, cognitive theory of life satisfaction. Actually, this is a congruity theory of life satisfaction. There's a typo there. Cognitive outlooks, and there's so much within cognitive outlooks. But let's try and again get a feel for that kind of research in brief. In brief, because there's so much there. Mood. Well, in personality social psychology, especially those people who are dealing with well-being, concentrated on well-being, subjective well-being, so much research that have linked mood induction to measures of subjective well-being. And frankly, I'm not surprised, because mood is very much related and much influence the way we respond to measures of subjective well-being. So mood induction is that what you're doing is we're putting subjects, again, if you're conducting an experiment, you're putting subjects in situations that ultimately will induce positive or negative mood. And then you ask them whether they're happy with life or whether they're happy with, certain life domains or express certain certain feelings, positive or negative feelings, positive or negative affect. So much of the research on mood induction, yes, has been associated with measures of subjective well-being. But what is most interestingly is the fact that some of the well-being measures are constructed in such a way that is very much based on capturing your mood on a daily basis. Look at the measures that I have in that bullet. Taken all together, how would you say things are these days? Would you say that you're happy, very happy, pretty happy, not happy? This type of measure of life satisfaction is based on recollection of one's mood experience recently. So, no doubt that mood is very much related to measures of subjective well-being. Those measures or those treatment of mood induction tends to be very closely, proximally related to measures of well-being. So at least we can make sense of that research that way. Causal attribution. Now, this is another area of research that is very interesting. And in that context, we have the attribution theory of happiness and attribution theory of depression. Now, the attribution theory of happiness says that the reason why people are happy or express higher levels of well-being on well-being types of self-reports is because they attribute much of their positive experiences to themselves. So they take credit to those positive circumstances surrounding their lives. I feel happy because everything around me is good. And the reason why things are good around me is because I made it so. So you take credit for it. And if you take credit for it, you feel happy. That's what we call attribution. You attribute those conditions to yourself. And if you make those attribution to yourself, positively speaking, again, those positive experiences, then again, that would account for your happiness. Depression, on the other hand, back in the 60s, 1960 something, a clinical psychologist by the name of Aaron Beck developed the theory of the attribution theory of depression, and we'll talk a little bit more about it. But the idea of this theory is that the reason why people are depressed is because of exactly the converse that we talked about in the context of the attribution theory of happiness. So the reason why people are depressed is because they attribute those traumatic, negative, adverse experiences surrounding them to themselves. I'm at fault. I'm the culprit. I'm a bad person. I'm not lovable. People run away from me, right? These are the kinds of attributions that causes depression. So these are the thoughts that are elicited, that are evoked as a function of those adverse circumstances tend to lead to depression. And depression is literally the converse of happiness. And that particular theory by Aaron Beck has literally become so popular to the point where the appraisals and it has been the basis, as you can see on this other slide, been the basis of what you call the rational emotive psychotherapy in clinical psychology. And the person who is attributed to developing this theory is Albert Ellis. And again, back in the 60s. And the rational emotive psychotherapy has blossomed into a very popular and very well-grounded theory with so much research which is now called cognitive behavioral therapy. Cognitive behavioral therapy. As a matter of fact, if you go to any clinical psychologist nowadays, I wouldn't say any, but most clinical psychologists nowadays kind of have embraced cognitive behavioral therapy. Now, what is cognitive behavioral therapy? The underlying notion of cognitive behavioral therapy, or what you might call rational emotive psychotherapy, same thing, is that people tend to distort reality. They have these cognitive distortions. They have these warped ideas about themselves and the world. They tend to engage in irrational thinking. On page 227 in the book, I listed a whole bunch of irrational beliefs that are, in essence, the bases that tend to induce or contribute to psychopathology. Things like, it is essential that one be loved or approved by virtually everyone in this community. A person thinking that he or she should be loved by everyone, if anyone expresses any kind of disappointment or withhold affection, then I am no good, he says, or she says, right? And by making that kind of attribution to oneself, because that person is holding firm to that belief that everybody should love me, everybody should like me. And if there's any one person out there that expresses any kind of disappointment in me, then I'm doomed, right? I'm doomed. This is a cognitive distortion. This is not realistic to hold on to a belief like this, because invariably, no one can have the love and affection from everyone. It's unrealistic, right? That's why you call it irrational thinking. And in the book, I list a whole bunch, at least 11 different cognitive distortions, beliefs that are not rational. And those people who ultimately experience a certain amount of psychopathology, like depression, hold on to these beliefs. And these beliefs are automatically activated. So the essence of cognitive behavioral therapy is to be able to, through practice, deal with those cognitive distortions and change those irrational beliefs into some beliefs that attempt to be a little bit more realistic, so that they would not be automatically activated in any circumstance. That's the essence of cognitive behavioral therapy. Now we're going to go to discuss the meaning to life. There's again a resurgence in research. It used to be the domain of philosophers, where they talk a lot more about meaning of life and happiness. Now psychologists have sort of embraced that and been talking about the psychology associated with meaning to life. So what's the theory behind it? And in the book, I discuss research dealing with the theory of personal meaning, and it break personal meaning, and based on the research, it broke it down into, there's a table 10.1, an operationalization of theory of personal meaning, meaning the Seeley instrument, and it breaks down the meaning to life, the way people interpret meaning to life in terms of cognitive aspects, motivational aspects, and affective components. And within that context, there are specific level attributions of meaning, and there are global aspects of attributions too. So let me just give you an example. If a person would take, for example, a person who is widowed, a widowed person, maybe a man loses his wife and becomes a widow. Well, that person would make certain kinds of attributions related to the, meaning to life. And it would be something like, I'm trying to pick an attribution, a personal attribution that makes sense in relation to that particular example. Maybe I picked the wrong example. But let's say if a person makes attributions like negative to the self, what I think about myself, I can't stand myself, that person is saying that my life doesn't have meaning, right? If a person is making an attribution like this, thinking about himself in that fashion, then there's hardly any positive meaning attributed to one's life. And therefore, again, that kind of thing is likely to cause unhappiness, or possibly to the extreme, depression. Then I have in the other bullet, meaning-based positive psychology intervention. Now, something about positive psychology. there's a movement within the psychology of well-being dealing with what you call positive psychology interventions. And there's all kinds of interventions, and there's so much research on those kinds of positive psychology interventions. We have interventions related to, again, here, meaning-based positive psychology intervention. What you're doing is you have an intervention to inject meaning to your life, and how there are specific activities and exercises that would make you, think about the purpose, your own life purpose, and therefore make meaningful attribution to your life, to what you do. Same thing with positive psychology interventions related to forgiveness, to gratitude, expressing gratitude, to meditation, to emulating people who are happy, positive psychology interventions related to mindfulness, positive psychology interventions related to character strength, on and on. There's so many positive psychology interventions. Another one that I like the best is, well, not the best, savoring. You savor those positive experiences. On and on, right? So we'll talk a little bit more about positive psychology interventions as we move along. Habituation is pretty simple, and that is well-being, or the positive and negative affect. People tend to habituate to certain circumstances, and therefore there are diminishing returns in terms of those positive or negative feelings. People habituate to those conditions, and therefore they experience less and less positive or negative affect, with repeated exposure. That's habituation. Cognitive frames. I want to just say something about multiple discrepancy theory. Multiple discrepancy theory is attributed to Alex Mikolos. Alex Mikolos is one of the founder of the social indicators movement, and used to be the editor of Social Indicators Research, which is, the primary journal in quality of life research. And he developed this theory, which is called multiple discrepancy theory. And it says that the way we feel about our lives, we express life satisfaction, is very much based on the kind of discrepancies that we have between how we construe ourselves, and then a bunch of standard of comparisons. Standard of comparison would be things like what others have. So I compare myself to what others have, and then I feel satisfied or dissatisfied as a function of the gap, of the discrepancy between these two. Or how about self compared to the best self one has had in the past? Self compared to what self expected to have by now. I should have, accumulated so much wealth by now, but look at, I'm still poor. I feel dissatisfied with my life. Self versus what one expects to have in the future. So if you think that you have an ideal self, then again, the discrepancy between your actual circumstance, how you perceive your actual circumstance, and what your ideal is. If there's quite a bit of discrepancy, then that leads to a high level of dissatisfaction with life. Self compared to what one deserves. Self compared to what one needs. Self compared to what one wants. See, all of that, this life satisfaction judgment is nothing more than judging your actual circumstances as they are, perceived as they are, compared to some sort of a standard of comparison, And these standard comparisons can be different, as shown in the multiple discrepancies theory. And the idea is that if people make those kinds of comparison, and if there are discrepancies between where you're at versus the standard of comparison, then that creates dissatisfaction in the judgment that you make about your life. Okay, I'm going to stop here. And we will continue. I would urge you to look at the chapter in the book and maybe look at the cognitive outlooks. And again, remember those positive psychology interventions that I talked about: mindfulness, gratitude, optimism, self-esteem, autonomy, locus of control, competence, connectedness, attributional style, ruminative style, and character strength. All of these are literally the basis of positive psychology interventions. Maybe you can, do this reading on your own so that we can jump right into the next chapter, which would be beliefs and values. So we'll talk about beliefs and values next time, starting next time. And hopefully we'll finish that module by next week. Okay, well, I bid you adieu for the time being. Farewell. Have a good rest of the week. And if you have any questions, then don't hesitate to contact me by email. I will be posting the video recording possibly by the end of today. And for those people who are taking the course for credit, I'll be sending you the questions, the essay questions related to the seminar, webinar, momentarily. Okay, bye now.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you
Bye.
so much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.